welcome everyone to the second day of our BioGeoSCAPES US Planning Workshop. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Adrian Marchetti. If you're just joining us for the first time for the workshop today, I'm an associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm one of the a member of the organizing committee. And today, we'd just like to start off by thanking you all for joining us here at the workshop, given it's a federal holiday being Veterans Day. We really appreciate the time to join us. So just an acknowledgement for being Veterans Day today, we just wanted to say that we would like to acknowledge the service and sacrifice of all members of our military in all branches, past and present, living and past. On this day, we honor all current and former members of the armed services, our country's greatest, in building the foundation and their courage and sacrifice. As more of a sort of more personal anecdote, I would just like to, just like to introduce you to Ed Mcclavick. And Ed, also known as great grandpa to my kids here, served in the armed forces during World War II. And Ed is now 101 years old, and he'll be 102 in April. And he was at Pearl Harbor at the start of the Second World War and survived the attack. He then served in Iwo Jima and Guam. And so to Ed and all our US military veterans, we thank you for your service. So now getting into today's activities, we'd like to start off by just providing a summary of the day one breakout discussions that many of you had participated in at the end of yesterday. We will then afterwards go to a poster session where we still have many great posters that folks that are participating in the workshop will present. And so that will be from 1:15 to 2 Eastern Standard Time. We will then come back from GatherTown back into Zoom, where we're going to have some updates from the nucleic acid omic and proteomic standardization and intercalibration activities. And then we have our second breakouts discussion of the day, and that will be, again, using Zoom breakouts and Jamboards. We also have lined up a few example talks of potential BioGeoSCAPE science questions that we are very excited about. And then we'll have a few minutes at the end of the workshop today for some summary and feedback.
Okay, so I'm your co-leader for today. I'm Alyson Santoro. I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And just to entice you, towards the end of the day, we're going to be having some speakers, some talks to entice you about some potential areas of research that already show really nice overlap between molecular biology and geochemistry. We have Scott Gifford from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Bethany Edwards from University of California, Berkeley, Julie Granger from the University of Connecticut, and Scott McCain from Dalhousie. Again, these are happening at 3:10 Eastern Time on this same Zoom link where you are right now. And just to recap from the Mentimeter exercises that we did at the end of the day yesterday, we'll repeat that exercise with some new questions at the end of the day today. So this is the word cloud about how everyone self-identifies. And when I look at this, one thing I think is interesting, there's not one word that's really huge. So we do have quite a good spread of a lot of different types of fields covered, but big front and center is biogeochemistry. And then responding to the question, how many more years of international planning and coordination do you think it will take to launch BioGeoSCAPES? Most people picked the middle, although it would be interesting to redo this with the different categories and see if everyone also picks the middle. But most people chose that it would take between 3 to 5 years, but in total, about 85% of us think that this is going to happen in less than 5 years. So that's also pretty encouraging.
So now what we're going to do is just go through some of the summary of the questions. And you can see here on the top left are the actual questions that we discussed in all our breakout groups. So for question one, the question was, what existing communities and networks should we connect with that are not shown in this diagram on the bottom right-hand side? again, this is sort of the bubble diagram that we presented before or yesterday, providing a bit insight into the networks we think would be involved in BioGeoSCAPES. And we received some excellent feedback, so thank you for all the groups there. And what we've done here is just summarized some of the programs and networks, et cetera, that did not make their way onto the bubble schematic. Things like culture collections, for example, at NCMA, or all the great progress that's been happening with imaging in terms of the high throughput imaging community, BGC Argo, Seymour. One thing that came up in quite a few groups was looking at marine LTRs, which essentially could be considered as local scale BioGeoSCAPES programs. A couple of comments that were raised, one is including community building, bringing everyone along is critical, proven successful method developing summer schools. So again, that's sort of something that we've been thinking about as well. Time series programs like BATS and HOTS could be very complementary to this program, as well as other communities and societies like the metabolomics community or society, sorry, SCORE. Another one that came up was looking at genomics databases, so things like NCBI and IMG. Another comment that was, I thought, pretty important to raise here was starting early to work with local communities takes time to build relationships. Not to give attention would hurt. Starting late doesn't work as well. Ask communities what they need. Lastly, open access communities, things like Protocols.io, GitHub, and ocean best practices systems would be something definitely for BioGeoSCAPES to people to reach out to.
So there actually was a lot of overlap in the answers to question 2 and question 1, which makes sense. If you think we should reach out to them, you probably think they're doing a good job of building community. Suggestions for examples of community building efforts that resonated with you. I just tried to take the high points when I was summarizing this. Many groups talked about the GeoTrace's intercalibration and the development of a measurement cookbook, which is a best practices manual, as one way to build community, because in the process of making sure measurements agree, it's a form of trust building. Again, as Adrian mentioned in the answers to question 1, the Long-Term Ecological Research, or LTER program, is already a network of networks. Each individual LTER site is required to coordinate with the other LTER sites across the country. The data science community was held up as an example of really good community building efforts. The software carpentries in particular were mentioned several times, and informatic workshops that have been held are thought to be good examples of community building. And also something that was mentioned in the answer to question 1, the Marine Biodiversity Observing Networks, or MBON. I actually haven't clarified whether this is the same as OBON or not, but these biodiversity observing networks are heavily funded by NOAA, and I believe the BOEM are funding those as well.
In relation to the last question, so what are potential barriers in interdisciplinary and inclusivity in the global effort like this, and how can we address them? The points raised here there were a number of groups that sort of hit on similar points. A big one being communication challenges. Things like how we communicate across disciplines, across nations, for example, and even looking at within our disciplines of, say, modelers versus observationalists. And some advice that came out of that was, basically organize a lot of workshops, consider summer schools for training of graduate students and whatnot, and also lab exchanges. So all of these things are definitely what we would hope to be able to achieve with BioGeoSCAPES. Another basic barrier or challenge could be in relation to intercalibration, standardization, availability of reference material and reference databases, data deposition and availability. And we know these are pretty large challenges. But I think we have to start somewhere, and we actually are in the process of creating some. But again, we just want to emphasize that BioGeoSCAPES is more of a concept than an actual program. And so part of what we're doing here is try to rally the troops for you to, if you have a certain measurement that you think could do with intercalibration, please, if you would like to step forward, because I think we are looking for the best ways in which we can intercalibrate all our data for such a program. So we're looking for champions for this process as well. Another sort of barrier is looking at the need for specialized measurements and computational skills, and especially when we consider across different nations and in their capacity and what they can and do, or can and cannot do, and providing PI incentives to contribute to collective efforts. And there was some really nice feedback that came out of this working or this breakout discussion in terms of being flexible in what we call BioGeoSCAPES compliant. And thinking about how maybe the GeoTraces model, how there are certain levels of being compliant in terms of contributing to the program. Providing data analysis as a way to involve nations that perhaps don't have the resources or ships or lab space to do certain measurements was a great suggestion. And thinking about things like dedicated centers for certain analyses, and for example, sequencing or flow cytometry or cell imaging, where certain nations perhaps can get measurements from these dedicated centers rather than having to provide their own. So these were all great suggestions. And I think with that, we pretty much will move on now. So I guess from here, the goal is we actually are going to sort of move over to GatherTown, where we are going to actually look at some posters again.